Hello and welcome everybody to the Tadaima Virtual Pilgrimage Online Film Festival. My name is Rob Buscher and I'm the curator of the festival. I'm also the board chair of the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival. Today we are going to be joined by Corey Tong. Corey is right here and he's really looking forward to having this conversation today about the work of the late, great Jeff Adachi. I think a lot of people knew him best as San Francisco's public defender, but less people know that he was a filmmaker. And I think we'd love to kind of delve into that today through this discussion and get a little bit more color on the life and career of Jeff Adachi, the filmmaker. So thank you for joining us today, Corey. And I guess to just get us started off, I'm wondering if you could start by introducing yourself, giving us a background on your work as a film curator and the producing work that you did with Jeff.
Thank you. Yes, I've had the great opportunity to screen my films with Rob and many other film festivals, and also broadcast my my work and help others broadcast their work, mostly on public television, PBS, various film channels, as well as on other streaming services like Netflix and so on. I have a background of film curating. I used to run the Asian American Film Festival in San Francisco many years ago, and before it was called CAMFest, called the San Francisco International Asian American Film Festival. And I also programmed with San Francisco International, with Frameline LGBT Film Festival, and have had many opportunities to work with film festivals and distributors all over the world, especially in helping to develop and then exhibit Asian American, Asian Pacific Islander work from both the US as well as internationally. So I've also brought in films, especially Asian and international films, into the US. So I've had a very broad background in the film industry, mostly independent films and documentaries. And I've had the great opportunity to work with many communities as well, Asian American, Japanese American, and from really all parts of the country, as well as from different the coasts. So I've had a great broad background in the way that both the political, social, cultural aspects of film all belong to the ecosystem of telling stories and getting them out there to audiences. So it's a fantastic platform that we have here. I had the great opportunity to work with Jeff on his last couple of films. And I mean, I've known Jeff for, over 20 years. And so I've seen him and also helped to exhibit his films, but only in the last few years had I had the opportunity to work with Jeff either during production or just as his films were nearing the end of production to help shape them and get them out there into the world. So I think actually Rob has screened a couple of his Jeff's films recently on the Tadaima series, correct?
Correct, yeah. And, I think this is a really good opportunity. And thank you for providing that background, because I think for the audience here, again, it's helpful to kind of have some context on this. It seemed like a no-brainer to invite Corey on here to do this, just some additional context for our audience. Because, Corey has been just such a fixture within the Asian American cinema movement for as long as you have been, but then especially that special working relationship that you and Jeff had is something that I think, we're lucky to be able to talk with somebody who knew him as you did and was able to work with him and collaborate on these creative endeavors. So thanks again for being here.
Of course, my pleasure. My only regret, of course, is that Jeff is not here in person to share his work with you and talk about his work, because both his work as an attorney, as a lawyer, as an advocate, public defender for many communities, not just Japanese American communities and Asian American communities, but from all walks and backgrounds of individuals and organizations in the U.S. and even internationally. His work as an attorney really is reflected in many of his films that he did. So that's something that I think we're going to be talking a little more about today. And I really look forward to that. So thank you.
Absolutely. So I guess for some additional context for the Tadaima audience, I know that Jeff's family was incarcerated during World War II. And I was just curious if you could provide some additional context for our audience, if you have additional details.
Yeah, I've had a chance to talk with Jeff over the years, and those experiences and what he has shared with me and what I've been able to share with other audiences in his absence is that his parents and grandparents were both incarcerated, and that experience later when he was a young person, teenager or young man, he asked his parents about that. And as he learned more about the experiences, I think it really motivated him. His understanding of the level of injustice that happened, really, really motivated his work. It was an inspiring force, a motivating force, but it really inspired him to go a lot further and really I believe he used that as fuel to do his work as an attorney, working in the area of civil rights and public defense, and this translated into his films. And I'm not sure how many of you had a chance to see the two films that Rob included. One is called America Needs a Racial Facial, and the other one is called The Ride, which is part of a larger film. Let's say a trilogy or part. It's a feature-length documentary, but The Ride, which is what we screened here, is the first segment, like the first act, if you will, of the film that ultimately was called Defender. But The Ride is really a very strong introduction to Jeff's work because it also features him as a public defender, defending a young man who was wrongly accused of something and then was arrested on a BART, which is the public transportation system here in the Bay Area. And Jeff defended him, and eventually it was, the charges were dismissed because it was a wrongful accusation. The young man happened to be Black, who was also actually Black and half Filipino. Many people don't know that, but Jeff really took it upon himself because this was one of the first cases with a body cam that the law enforcement had on them. But even getting the video to be used as evidence was not allowed at first. And even so, every step of the way, there are these hurdles to integrate the evidence into the case. And I think this is an example of the way that Jeff used his mind as an attorney, a very strategic thinker, to also convey in his films in terms of the storytelling. Lawyers have to tell stories in order to either take their cases to court or to write or appear. If you're a trial lawyer, people really are strategically thinking and crafting stories. And I think in many of this, one uses the same tools or similar tools in creating films, and then really putting it out there to basically make your case or tell the story in as truthful manner as one can, but also being strategic about it, because you're telling this to an audience, whether it's a jury or a judge or society at large or an audience, filmmaking exhibition audience.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great way to kind of understand what this dual career was like for Jeff, to be able to look at crafting a narrative in the courtroom as well as on screen. And that's certainly come up in conversations that we've had about his work in the past. I guess that's obviously his passing was very tragic for a number of reasons, but I think as a filmmaker, we were just kind of starting to see him really integrate his work as a law professional into the screen and into the works that he was doing. So I think it's additionally tragic that, you know, as Jeff began to sort of hone these two parts of his life into a single vision, unfortunately, he was unable to continue to produce such work. But I guess I'm curious. So we're talking a little bit about the two films that we showed this week. We also showed the Jack Soo story about yeah. So just thinking about his film as career as a whole, I'm wondering if you might want to talk a little bit about some of the earlier work that he did prior to the two shorts that we looked at this week.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. I can't see who's in the audience. I can't ask you to raise your hands, but uh, some of you may have seen the Jack Soo Story. There's another film that Jeff did very early on called The Slanted Screen, which is about Asian American male representation on the big screen or TV screen, meaning in Hollywood, in acting, whether TV or films. So he looked at, he did a documentary with many interesting interviews about that subject. And even though that was done more than 10 years ago, I think it was done, 12, I'm sorry, I'm blanking, but it was definitely done more than 10 years ago. And that film, coupled with the Jack Soo story, which is about the actor who became very well known, but if some of you have seen the film, if not, this is a little bit of a, I'm giving some things away, but Jack Soo, as an actor, changed his name, and his stage name is Jack Soo, but his real name, he's actually Japanese American. And that was something that he did. And just the fact that someone felt he needed to do that, reveals so much about the time and the period about, this was, after World War II. There was a lot of, well, I don't have to explain much to this audience, but we know, how much both pain and, all the injustices that happened. And so for somebody to be going into a public domain, a public role, or a field where somebody felt like they had to change their identity or hide the fact that the outward fact that they were not, that he was not a Japanese American, just says so much about the state of that time. And so that film, Jack Soo, as well as Slanted Screen, which is about Asian American and male representation, the remarkable and tragic thing is that so many of those issues are still present today. And even though there has been amazing progress, you could see these films and think, a number of these challenges or issues that are brought up still remain today. They may be more in the foreground, or people can talk about it a little more, but ultimately it really is, the issues are there and they need to be worked on. So it's a never-ending challenge for all of us in this field of filmmaking, storytelling, public public exhibition, to continue to reshape the story, not just on the outside, but really from the inside. And I think Jeff understood that early on, because these films were made during a time, like before there was a lot of social media, before there was even the very robust internet access that we have now, and all of the different platforms that exist. I think when he made those films, Netflix was still doing DVD, sending you through the mail. So this was a time where he had this, he recognized these injustices or the disparities, the inequalities, and he wanted to share these stories. So from an emerging filmmaker, these were among his first films. He did them, and you can look at them and you think they may be not as production-wise or cinematographically, cinematographically sort of as refined as let's say his latest film that he did. I think the ones that you saw, the short films, but the stories are there and they're very, very powerful. And I think Jeff took the opportunity in telling these stories to also teach himself filmmaking and to work with tools and to refine them more. Over the years, he's worked with a great team of people, Chihiro Wimbush, Jim Choi. There are a number of people who, over the year, Walt Louis in Los Angeles, people who are basically professional filmmakers who do this 24/7. And so he also brought in teams, small teams, because many of these films were done independently. So so over the years, he improved his craft, if you will. He learned more about the storytelling. And I think as he became a more experienced attorney as well, in the middle of all this, he was elected public defender of San Francisco City and County. So he was able to he had a very powerful trajectory as a public defender and as an attorney really taking place. And he actually, at one point, just a little earlier than that, he actually was one of the candidates for mayor of San Francisco City and County. But he became public defender, and the head public defender, which is one of the only elected positions of public defenders in the country. I think there are only a couple of states, Florida, there are a couple of other states, and this is the only county in California that elects its public defender. So Jeff, assumed this position. He ran and he won, and he, at the same time as that, we always joke that he had a very busy day job, and then his evening job, like the way that some people might tend bar or drive Uber. His night job was he moonlighted as a filmmaker, and so his later films became either short documentaries that became part of bigger ideas, like a longer feature project, or as I mentioned earlier, the film The Ride is part of a larger film called Defender. And then Jeff was in the middle of working on a couple of other projects that I was also working with him on. And so these films were very much about he basically created these films in his own backyard, meaning he took his work as a public defender and he integrated those into the stories of his films. So occasionally there were cases, very specific cases, whether it was an undocumented immigrant or a wrongly, accused person who, of a crime. And as we all know, public defenders are there for those who do not have resources, but who would like to have a defense when needed, or representation when they're needed. So, he took that role. As you can tell, it's many layered, but it was like he was functioning, he was going on all engines, all of his resources were working, that he tapped into. So it both motivated and drove his work, but it also inspired him for the stories that he wanted to tell, because he was right there seeing these individual cases and many of the injustices that happen. And so he often took the opportunity to turn those into his films. So the one film that you saw called The Ride is a really great example of that. I think it's a beautiful, really well-made film, very powerful, and it's only 15-16 minutes. And that film has screened all over at different film festivals. And then the other one, Racial Facial, is like it's a montage, like a music video. but it has incredibly powerful, very, very, disturbing images of the US through the years, and how the systematic, you know, biases, prejudices, racism, all really are there on display in 7 minutes, I think, up till today. So that's an incredibly powerful document as well.
Absolutely. And just thinking back on some of the recent films as well as his earlier works, I was just thinking a lot about how Jeff gradually sort of becomes a character in his own films. And I guess I'm curious to what extent that was intentional from your perspective. My reading of it is that because Jeff was so interested in this sort of history of early Hollywood and dating back as early as Sesshu Hayakawa during the silent days in the slanted screen. Certainly his interest in Goro Suzuki in the Jack Soo Story is another great example of that. And I think that in a lot of ways, Jeff is kind of looking at the absence of role models. And I can't speak for him. I don't know what his situation was growing up or to what extent he had those kinds of role models. But certainly on screen, there was a dearth of these for most Asian Americans, and I think particularly Asian American men and young boys, not really seeing positive role models. And it's sort of remarkable that I think in his parallel career as a lawyer, he then does really become this leader and this role model that many people in the Japanese American and Asian American community looked up to, and sort of became a person that is worthy of being featured within a film as that kind of missing role model. So again, I'm just kind of curious if you would agree with that assessment to any extent, or if you think that it was sort of an intentional direction that he eventually went into, or was it perhaps more out of convenience that he had access to these incredible stories and wanted to kind of project that story further through his film?
Well, I would say yes, yes, and no, and yes, and maybe. It's many layered. I think he is featured really. He is really featured in the film The Ride, and that's the one that he is most prominent in. In other films that deal with public defense cases or legal justice cases, he may be on the periphery, and he's also been featured in other films that other people have made as well, meaning he's been the subject as the public defender of films about particular cases or situations that happen. But in terms of films that he has made, so in The Ride and in the larger film called Defender, which is made up of 3 different parts, all of which he had a role as a lawyer. And also, just to clarify again, these are documentaries, so he's not acting. He is being himself. And the camera is trained on him as a lawyer, as a public defender. So in The Ride, that film is really because he was making the film, but he realized that he couldn't be shooting the film, and there would need to be a perspective because he was the one who was representing the client. So, I think partially out of convenience. I think if he had another body, if there was, or if he had 4 arms, he might have, wanted to be filming, shooting, asking himself questions, but he, it's physically impossible to do that, and so there, he had Jim Choi and a couple of others who were filming as well, and then in terms of editing, he helped to craft the story with Chihiro. And with a few others, Walt and a few others like myself, who were looking at cuts and helping to shape the film. But really, he was the featured subject, along with the Michael, the young man who was charged with the crime. of carrying a weapon, which he did not have. I mean, Michael did not have a weapon, but he was wrongly accused of that on a train station, on a train car. And so I think it's really, Jeff knew that he, so it would be actually pretty great to be having this conversation with him like right now, because he would probably say yes and no. He couldn't do it physically because he couldn't make the film, like filming himself, but he also, I think, learned over his making films that it's also good to have other vision, other perspectives. And if he is going to be looking at one of his cases, it's nice to also be looking at it from a little bit of a distance, because it helps to capture the moment rather than being, a self, like a diary, or like just a piece about yourself that you're doing, about a personal journal. So I think it was unintentional, and yet I think he always knew that his work as a lawyer was very valuable and very, very appreciated by the communities that he represented, as well as the much larger communities, upon which all of his cases had an impact, because so many of them meant bigger things than just the individual case. But for example, this particular film, when you see the film, you realize that it was one guy's perception about this young black kid who he thought had a gun. And so he called the police. The police, again, did not filter themselves. They basically, arrested him wrongly without telling the young man what he was being arrested for. And they discovered that he didn't have a gun. So, all of these things, I think Jeff realized this is a story that, so we used the body cam on the footage. Other filming that came on, cinematographers, photographers followed the story into the courtroom, discussions of the trial. So a lot of these pieces were captured by other people, other cinematographers. And so the last two films became a little bit more of a team effort. And then I think it actually served the films very well, because Jeff is also a very charismatic person, this very, this, he has also this sort of magnetic quality that people are drawn to, and it shows up even on screen, so he inadvertently, I guess, became this, the subject, if you will, like the star. And he was also good. He understood, I think, the way that we these days, or society, can use media in your favor. I mean, you can not, I don't mean your favor, like just to self, promote oneself, but I mean, we can use it in a very good way. And if you know how to use it, and if you're a good articulate speaker, and if you can convince someone, so again, he's pulling out his toolkit as a lawyer, and he's also he's knowing that, I think he understood that the power to be able to articulate and tell these stories is very meaningful. It has a big impact to those who are watching or those who are listening. Again, whether you're a juror or an audience member. And I think because he had these skills that were getting refined as well, I think he would probably be right now thinking, "Oh, you're making me blush because this." I'm thinking of him as a star, and yet I think he was, and I think he was aware of it, and even though sometimes maybe people might have perceived him to be a little bit like, oh, he was confident and self-assured. I think if you got to know him, you would realize he's also very disarming. He's also very genuine. And when we were talking with him, whether it was about a case or a whiskey or a film, it became very real and genuine. and one-to-one. And so this charisma was a very natural thing. It didn't seem like it wasn't acting. I guess that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, and
So
I
how about
think
you, Rob? I mean, you know Jeff a little bit too over the years.
yeah, and
What do
I
you think?
think to be honest, you know, I don't know to what extent that Jeff did consider himself as the hero of his own films, and I don't think that was intentional, as you mentioned, and you know, I think out of convenience probably he appears more in The Ride. But I think it really would have been interesting to see how that could have evolved further. And just again, looking at the filmmaking technique that the evolution of his early work, which is kind of a standard like talking head format, documentaries, archival footage. And then in the last films that he was working on, where it's very much like run and gun, engaging on the ground documentary, shooting of live events, taking footage again from innovative sources like body cam footage. And yeah, just a shame that we weren't able to see more of that. And sort of, I guess, dovetailing into that, we do have a question from one of our audience members. Robert Shoji asks, are there any unfinished film projects that Jeff was working on? And I'm wondering if you might be able to tell us a little bit about the last piece that you two were working on together.
Yeah, we were working on a film that sorry, I'm just trying to making sure that technically things are good. There was a film that Jeff started along with a similar team, those who I mentioned with you, also Chihiro and myself and a couple of other people who were involved in this. And it was about a case that, and I can't talk too much about it because we're still going through some of the administrative parts of the film and assessing its viability and timeliness and so forth. But it is a film that was being done about a particular case where a man, an undocumented immigrant, was found a gun in San Francisco on a pier. He was homeless at the time. He picked up the gun. It went off, and it accidentally killed someone. Unfortunately, horrible, outcome. But he was charged for that murder, even though it was an accident. And then what happened? It became politicized because the current administration, before it was currently in office, used it as part of the campaign, and it became a very divisive issue about undocumented immigrants being, bad people, basically murderers and killers. That's basically what this story turned into. And so Jeff realized, along with his public defender's office, that this was not the case. Not just are immigrants not bad people as a class of people, but and okay, we don't have to go there. We're all immigrants. Many of us, most of us are in some background. But that's another story, and that's another film. However, it's related to this because it was used as all immigrants are bad. And Jeff realized that these threads and using that kind of rhetoric is the same that has been happening, over every generation in this country. So this systematic sort of racial biases and prejudices are really, they're very deep. And so he recognized this, and that's what this particular film is about. I'm going to go back to another film, The Ride, that some of you may have seen. As I mentioned, it's part of a larger film series, let's say 3 shorter films put into one feature film called Defender. And the film was not quite finished. So some of us are still looking at perhaps there are ways to finish the film, do a little bit of editing and finish this up. But it's a difficult task to take now that Jeff is gone. But that the reason I'm mentioning this is there was another project that was born from Defender, which is the three-part series, three-part film. And that was something that Jeff, along with others, have been talking about, which is a series about the public defender's office. And whether that series became like a docu-series that was on different potential cases that were available to be public, record. I mean, they're all eventually public record, but it depends on, whether a case wants to be exposed while it's being tried and so forth, or investigated. So there was a lot of idea about using that structure of taking different cases and what these cases represent in a much larger context to society in the US. So we had talked about developing these short case specific films into a larger series, which I think could be great, fantastic, because it really does, they really demonstrate all of the many of the biases and the systematic, problems that exist in this country with many groups, underrepresented groups, minorities, many communities, parts of society, end up being somehow represented if you look at these stories and individual cases that the public defender's office takes on.
It's an amazing concept, and I do hope that it does get made at some point. And just kind of back to the other film project related to the immigrant man who was charged with the homicide. It's just interesting, to think about, again, his earlier work and how it plays into the stuff that he was working on towards the end of his film career. Particularly, I think America Needs a Racial Facial does a great job of helping us understand maybe what Jeff's thought process was in being able to connect these threads. And, looking at that very innovative montage music video editing style that was used for that piece. It just really is a shame that Jeff's not here in this particular moment that we're living through. And just thinking about the sort of nationwide uprisings and the movement for Black lives and the conversation around police practices. I just feel like Jeff had so much to contribute to that conversation, and he certainly did. And I think, honestly, will continue to contribute via his films that are available for people to see. But I guess, thinking about this moment that we're living through, how do you think that Jeff's works and other issue-oriented films can sort of play a role in this advocacy landscape?
I mean, I think that Jeff would be, well, the two parts of Jeff, let's say, that were integrated through some of these more recent films, I would project that his public defender's office would be very busy because there's so many legal consequences that are coming out of what is happening today. And not everyone can afford a private attorney or representation. And so I think that on the public defender's side, their hands would be very full. He would be very busy, very active in many of these cases that might still be coming out for years to come. Whether it's somebody being, evicted from their home because of they were not able to pay rent because they did not have, something like that may be, on a micro level of an individual. But what it does is represents a much larger problem that exists today, but that is going to continue to exist for years to come because of what's happened. But also, given the Black Lives Matter and the way that people of color in this country have been, systematically, it's systematic. So many of these biases and the outcomes are ingrained, they're institutionalized, for generations. So I think he would be. I mean, I know this is an odd way to put it, but he would be having a heyday. He would be like, oh my God, there's so many stories to be following and to be telling. So he'd be wanting to like represent them all, and then he'd be wanting to make films about them all too. So I think he would be, really this time, as we know, I mean, in my opinion, some really great things about U.S. society are happening, and we can see the way that people are working, and the healthcare workers and the essential workers are great. But then the ugliest, the worst parts of the U.S. is showing its color. They're horrific things. They're really horrible things that are happening both today as well as, again, will be happening, in the months and probably years to come. So many of the inequalities, so many of the injustices, they're all showing up, everywhere we look. You can probably walk outside our homes into our towns, and the way that things are being, things are so divisive. So I think he would be really looking at this and thinking, gosh, there's so many, this is all coming out. We need to document this. All of us, all of filmmakers, we all need to be telling these stories. And so I'm thinking that he would probably be, wanting to document himself, whether he had a little crew or whether he was following a case, a particular case that the public defender's office was doing, or on a larger scale, looking at the political landscape and the elections coming up. I think there's so much, there's so many stories that need to be told, and not, I mean, we hear the stories in the news, on TV, online, in various media publications, but he would be wanting, the idea of filmmaking and crafting individual stories, very powerful stories that can go out wider, are very important. And so I think, though, that in his absence, films like America Needs a Racial Facial are very relevant and will continue to be, because, and I highly recommend, maybe Rob, you can tell everybody, the film is still online and available for a limited time, or did it already go off?
It's available until the end of today. So for those of you who are watching this live, hopefully.
Please watch sometime today, because it's only 7 minutes, and it says it in a very hip, and like a music video, it says it in a very accessible, hip way. You're looking at basically what is happening today and many of the origins, but in 7 minutes. It's this little slice of the connection between slavery, of lynching, of the way that many of these horrendous injustices have happened over the years. And they may take slightly different forms today, but they're still there, and many people, or some people, still think the same way. So I think looking at films like Racial Facial and also The Ride are incredible documents. It's almost as if, these are not the only films. There's so many documentaries out and available that you can hunt for. Many resources, you can go to online platforms. If any of you have Canopy, it's an educational distribution streaming site that has it's an aggregate of many distributors. Amazing films, or PBS, many things are streaming there, or any of your local affiliates. Even Netflix has a whole bunch of docs, HBO, all of the, and then film festivals, whether they become virtual or in-person activities. Many of and if you're looking at Asian American, Japanese American related films, CAM, Center for Asian American Media, VC, which is based in Los Angeles, that produces the LA Asian Pacific Festival, Philadelphia, many Asian American festivals all over the country also have very robust programs that can either guide you to, or often exhibit these films. And they may be on a limited basis, but if you are good at searching, you can usually find the films available. So I think it's up to us, those who have the good fortune to be either healthy or have the means to be able to watch right now, and sit and learn. We need to do that now, and we need to see everything that we can to learn. If we're not physically out there ourselves, this is a great opportunity to take this window of staying in a lot more to access these films. So I would highly encourage you, if you have a chance, to watch the two films. In fact, Jack Soo is still up to?
No, unfortunately.
Rob?
It's no longer up. Yeah, it was last week that we were showing the Jack Soo Story.
Oh, okay. The sound. So, you know, it's, but I would highly recommend watching these films, and I think, you know, people learn a lot, or they're just reminders, or watch it again, you know, just to watch it with more nuanced eye, watch it and think, oh, wow, this could have been made today. Well, it was made not that long ago, but I think there are great stories out there, and we're really, you know, fortunate to be able to share them with everybody.
Yeah, and I think you know, the
And
theme for this particular week of the pilgrimage was, what is citizenship? And you know, it was a very intentional choice that we wanted to highlight Jeff's work in this way, because honestly, I can't think of another Japanese American filmmaker who's active today that has been able to engage in active citizenship to the extent that Jeff demonstrated, both through his legal career and through his filmmaking career. So, you know, it's, I think, following some of your statements, it's great to think about at this moment when we are, many of us, sort of stuck in quarantine, wanting to use this time to sort of engage in conversations, educate ourselves, better ourselves, to be able to participate in duties of citizenship, which in my definition also includes activism and advocacy, and protest when necessary. So, you know, that definitely, I want to think that Jeff would agree with those kinds of things. And I think based on his film work, certainly seems to be the case. We have one other comment in the chat.
are there any from your audience that might have?
Yes. So Kenji Taguma, he was commenting earlier in the conversation about the Asian American Arts Foundation. Kenji wrote, in the 1990s, Jeff started the Asian American Arts Foundation, which presented 3 Golden Rings Awards, essentially to recognize Asian Americans in the arts. I'm wondering if you would be able to provide a little more context about the Asian American Arts Foundation or the Golden Rings Award.
You know, I'm only somewhat familiar. I wasn't the organizers of that event. But by the way, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Because it's getting very broken up, the back and forth. So the Arts Foundation was formed, yeah, some years ago, and it was to honor community individuals or organizations who really, through culture and the art, really made an impact on the landscape of Asian American existence and culture in the U.S. And I believe, you know, again, I'm sorry if I can't speak expertly on this subject, but I believe even early on, individuals like Rich, you know, were emerging, as well as lesser known, you know, organizations. And I believe there's a site. I've been to several of those actual, you know, events in person, and uh, there, you know, people represented not just from the San Francisco, even though the event was physically held in the Bay Area in San Francisco, I believe that individuals were honored from different parts of the country. And but that's a good thing to research, so we can all go do our homework.
Absolutely. And I guess it just goes to show, how involved that Jeff was in so many areas that really supported the Asian American community. I know he was also an active JACL member in the San Francisco chapter, and certainly cared a great deal about the Japanese American community at large. Um, I guess we're kind of getting towards the end of our time here today, and I'm wondering if you have any kind of closing thoughts about what we could do in this moment to sort of continue the work that Jeff was doing. Just thinking a little bit about maybe what his vision was.
Well, I would just add that as I mentioned, as we both were talking earlier, I think he would find also that some of the best parts of humanity and the worst parts of society are showing up right now. And I think he would really want to be doing things. He would probably be, as I mentioned, representing a lot of cases or individuals through the public defender's office, but he would also be wanting to look at these things and make films about them, or make document them, because they really are, these stories are very important tools and vehicles for everyone to learn if they cannot physically be out themselves in a demonstration, or if they're not physically or financially able to support something um, that is very, important, whether it's an emerging movement, or, a structural legal system that needs to, or justice system that needs to be reworked or fight in little ways, in big ways. You take what you're available to do, or whatever you're able to give, and then maybe give a little bit more, but really try to just learn more. I think many of us know, I mean, I live in San Francisco. I'm originally from Hawaii. By the way, I'm half Japanese, even though my last name is Tong. Um, and I feel very grateful that um, and I think it's interesting, when Jeff found out that, I could tell that his wheels were turning, and he thought, okay, so you even understand them in a little bit more than like some Chinese guy, out there who's um, who may not have quite the cultural understanding of the inner workings of a Japanese American family, but I certainly do in some ways. And but I think, fortunate, because I live in the Bay Area, we are around many people who, by choice, by design, by um, through a lot of work, have managed to learn, have managed, there's a big community here. I think in this position, and we have a responsibility also to share what we know about each other, and about the cultures that we're living in, and why is it that some parts of the country are doing so poorly, in terms of whether it's virus, in terms of racial injustices and inequalities. And I mean, nowhere is perfect. We know that nowhere is perfect. But I think Jeff would be thinking, oh yeah, we have a lot here. We need to take what we have, our resources, or what we've learned, the means that we have, and put it to good work. That's what I feel like he would be thinking. And I think that's why we got along so well in many ways, on personal level. We were also friends, not just people who worked, and worked their skills to help our projects, but we were personally friends. And I feel like there was a lot of respect of him by the community, and even if individuals didn't agree with everything he was doing, I think the tenacity and the gumption that he had, he was really motivated from really, really deep and good places, I feel. And so that, and then he just had some, natural skills, and then he had learned skills that he used filmmaking, and then he tried to pull together teams. Sometimes we didn't all get along. I mean, we all know that as filmmakers and media makers, we don't always agree on things creatively or producing. But I think there's the intent. The intent is there, and that was a huge place to start. So I would really encourage everyone, maybe on his behalf, but also on coming from Tadaima and the way and the reason why you put these series together. It's very enlightening. It's amazing. And even if people have seen one film, to be able to see them in the context of each other is extraordinary. These opportunities are, they're many, but they're also not always easily accessible. So, or you can't always see these 10, within the same few weeks, or maybe you didn't know about them. And I think it's amazing what, every step of the way, the filmmakers, the storytellers, the funders, the exhibitors, the distributors, it goes all, up and down this entire ecosystem. It's very important for all of them to thrive. But then we also want the audiences, and we want the audiences to learn. We want feedback, and we want everybody to respond. And then to hopefully some of them might inspire you to do something, take some action, and it could be in a lot of different ways. So I think that's how Jeff would be feeling. He would be very riled up right now.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And, I think that you've done a beautiful job of sort of encapsulating, I think, a lot of the thoughts and feelings that Jeff may have had living through this particular moment. But I just wanted to thank you for sharing so much of your time and your memories of your friend and creative partner, Jeff, with us this afternoon. We certainly appreciate it. And, I think it's important for us as a community to be able to recognize the incredible work that Jeff did in his life, and continue to remember it, and share his message in the ways that you mentioned. And yeah, I hope, if anything, that this session can help some of our community members learn more about the filmmaker side of Jeff Adachi. So thank you very much for your part in helping to keep his memory alive and continue the work.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say also want to thank many people who helped this, not just this program, but over the years, Mutsuko Adachi, his wife, many friends and colleagues, Chihiro Wimbush, Jim Choi, I've mentioned them before, Walt Louis, Leo Chang. Many people have contributed to the films, or in some way or another. CAM, Center for Asian American Media, Pacific Film Festival, again, Philadelphia, many of the festivals and the platforms, San Francisco Film, SF Film, all really together. We make up this big community and play different roles in it. And it's really important for all to thrive. So also support, all your cultural media, your public broadcasters, because they all play really big roles in what it takes to get these stories out there. And the Public Defender's Office of San Francisco.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you. And we look forward to continuing to appreciate this work. And thanks for joining us this afternoon, Corey.
Yeah.
Take care.